Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. My name is Katrina Beshears, and I am here with some fabulous subject matter experts regarding ACEs, adverse childhood
Experiences.
experiences, excuse me. And we're going to be talking about how this impacts our community, why we chose this community conversation. And we are located in Farmington Hills, Michigan. We've done a few of these, and tonight we're going to focus in on adverse childhood experiences, how this impacts folks through their lifespan, how it impacts our community, and what we can actually do to improve these things and to mitigate that, the effects of that. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Don Munter, who is going to be sharing his personal story, and that will feed into the panelists who've got some fabulous information to share with us. And I think go ahead and take it away, Don.
Well, thank you. Let me start off by saying that our panelists are professional people in the field. I am not. I know very little about psychiatry or psychology. I am not a social worker. I'm just a regular guy. But I was kind of assigned to come up with a topic for this discussion. And I said, how about trauma? And I thought about it, and I decided that was way too broad a subject. So I started looking around, and I found the ACEs test, which you will hear about later. And that takes a look at how many adverse childhood experiences you had. And the more you had, the greater your chance of having psychological problems as an adult. So I thought that was kind of fascinating. So I brought it back to the panel, and they liked the idea. And a little more of my research shows that it isn't necessarily the experiences that you personally have as a child, but it can also be the adverse experiences that your parents have had. If your mother has had, I find this hard to believe, but it can be in vitro, that the fetus will pick up the vibes of how she is reacting to this experience. And even as I thought this was really fascinating. I knew nothing about it. Be the first to admit it. And I'll ask the panelists when I'm relating my personal story, if they think I'm off base, feel free to tell me. Because I should say, this is also can be multi-generational. There is some question whether it actually can be genetic, passed down from parent to child to grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to go back to 1930. My father's parents got a divorce. And I call that trauma with a small t. Okay. It was not a good situation. He and his mother were very much on their own with no real means of support. It was during the Depression. And the story goes that as a 13-year-old, he was out on the street selling pencils and selling apples and that kind of thing to try and bring in some money. And his father, who was not working or during the Depression was making next to nothing, would come to him for money as well. So this led, I believe, to all kinds of psychological problems. Number one was a fear of leaving home, a fear of leaving his mother alone. And so I think that's where it all began. I can't be sure. I was not there. And so most of this information I got from an older sibling who she was not there at that time either, but she remembers stuff that I was not aware of and really only found out about within the last month. Let's move on to 1941, World War II. He enlisted in the Navy and went for basic training in the Catskills in New York. Apparently, the fear of agoraphobia, the fear of leaving home, of not being home, took effect. This is during his basic training. He was hospitalized. And after he, quote, recovered, unquote, somehow medical records got mixed up and he was discharged, medical discharge. So that's incident number 2 that we're aware of. Everybody was going to war. Everybody was enlisted. I think maybe he felt left out. So he hired on with the Office of War Information and was sent to London. How he did this, I don't know. And after Paris was liberated, he went to Paris. And I'm thinking in my own mind, correct me if I'm wrong, that psychological issues can surface and then go below the surface. And then years and years later can surface again.
Sure.
And I think that's what happened to him. He also, I believe, developed a fear of being alone.
Sure.
He did have an affair when he was overseas. He did return. They reconciled in 1945. And he had to find employment. They were living in New York City. He found a job in New York City. And I think we're going okay. My sister was born during that time. And in 1945, they bought a house out on Long Island. And apparently it did not go well. He had to commute. He had to leave home, had to commute into New York City for work. My sister was old enough that she vaguely remembers the scenes of crying and hysteria before he walked out of the house because he did not want to go. He didn't want to leave home. And he was traveling alone into New York City. After several years, his therapist said, well, what you should do is just leave your job. Get a job on Long Island. So during this time, he was the breadwinner. My mother was home with my sister, who was 3, and me as a newborn. And getting him to go to work was a necessity, an economic necessity. So my sister remembers all of these sessions in the morning, and he had to walk 2 blocks to get the bus, take the bus to get the train into New York. And so she remembers very well meeting him at the bus stop and walking him home. During my growing up years, I remember, and of course it never occurred to me at the time, that he never went anywhere alone. If we were going, like on Sunday mornings, we had this little ritual. We would go to a delicatessen and get bagels and everything. I had to go with him. Of course, at that age, I didn't understand why. He was a photographer. He started a photography business in the house. Clients came to him. We had a big backdrop in the living room. But when he had to go out on jobs, he was on the wedding, bar mitzvah, etc. circuit. He hired the kid across the street to go as his assistant. After a few years, when I was old enough, I would go as his assistant. He and I used to do all the grocery shopping together. So again, as a child, this does not register. Looking back on it now, I can see his fear of just being alone.
Sure.
And he seemed to be okay with the agoraphobia if somebody went with him. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. In 1957, when I was 11 years old, I suddenly had problems going to school. And going out the back door to go to school, I would suddenly be nauseous and I would have to race for the bathroom. And I've been wondering again now. I always thought it was because I didn't like school. I hated school. But was it a transference? Was it that I didn't want to leave home, or was it because I was becoming aware of his situation, maybe unconsciously, that I had to be there with him? I missed a lot of school that year. My parents were astute enough to realize that I needed some help. They got me help. I spent a year with a child psychologist. We just played games and everything. I didn't know what was going on. And then it kind of went away. It just wasn't there. It was there, but it was internal. And then in 2018, my older son committed suicide. That's what we call trauma with a capital T. And that's something you never really recover from, but you learn to deal with it. And I've been dealing with it just fine. And then sometime in 2019, I had what is now considered an extreme anxiety episode. And when that occurred, I kept moving along, and then again in October of 2019, I was on a walk in Philadelphia and I tripped on an uneven sidewalk. I landed right here on the cement. Fortunately, nothing was broken. My glasses saved my eyes. And there was some cranial bleeding, but that only lasted not even 24 hours. That would, I guess we would consider a trauma with a small t. But it all kind of mushroomed. It all kind of came to the surface just before COVID. And anxiety set in. I was literally afraid to move from one room in my house to another. Don't even think about going outside. Plus depression along with it. And I didn't want to do anything. I didn't do anything. And I have to say, after about 3 months, I went to my wife one morning after I had slept for 15 minutes. And I said, I need help. Well, we had an in because trying to get help for psychological problems during COVID, very difficult. But we went to somebody who knew a psychologist who we spoke to, and he took me on as a patient. Fortunately, we hit it off right away, which doesn't always happen. I am still in therapy, and I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not afraid to talk about it. The stigma, has got to be eliminated. So anyway, I'm doing very well, and I found that besides the therapy, the best thing that helped me was when COVID waned a bit and we could open up a little bit. We hadn't had anybody in our house for a year and a half. Socialization, extremely important, but even more important, I think, is what I'm doing right now, is talking about it. I'm very open about it. I will talk to anybody about it. If they give me an opening, I will talk their ear. I think that really is the best therapy. So I would say to all of you, lay people out there, if you're having difficulty, find somebody, talk about it, get it out in the open. It's the best thing for you. And now I'm at the point where I'm happy to say it's subconscious, but if it reappears on the surface, number one, I know what it is. And number two, I know how to deal with it. End of story. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Don. I really appreciate you, the bravery it took for you to share not only your personal story, but the family history, which I think is really a key piece of our healing journey. And a lot of times those pieces are forgotten. And I appreciate how you also laid out that adverse childhood experiences, are very common, unfortunately. And Dr. Shakir and our other subject matter experts are also going to be talking about that. But just for some brief statistics, we had this personal story. When we talk about ACEs, it's typically from 0 to 17 years old. And about 64% of adults in the US report that they've had at least one type of ACE event before the age of 18. 1 in 6 adults report having 4 or more. And so again, I think that was a little bit about what Don was saying about how it kind of builds and you build over time, whether it's individually or collectively as, family, generationally. And these are things to talk about. And I love how you pointed out that part of your healing journey, Don, has been number one, to recognize it and how to deal with it. That the things that we've gone through in life, we can move on, we can have the skills and build a quality life. So pivoting to Dr. Shakir, I wanted to just ask you, can you tell us a little bit more about the Center of Disease Control, CDC's Kaiser Permanente, the actual study that birthed the ACEs, what we us are familiar with? Yes, please. Thank you.
Sure. So before I talk about it, thank you so much, Don. I think, and I want to point out that the first step of healing is actually embracing our experiences for what they are, and then finding the courage for self-disclosure. I think we own our experiences, and that is when we start healing. And healing, in my opinion, is not all the way possible unless we get to that point. So thank you so much, Don, for sharing your experiences. And I bet there are many people in the audience who will recognize the importance of.
Aware of it. I'm sure my wife is aware of it. I don't smile that much. Yeah, I used to. I don't laugh. I can tell you the last time I had a really good laugh.
Sure.
But the spontaneity of doing things, that's returned.
And that is a good restart. We have to, we all need motivation and purpose in life, and the courage to embrace that we still need a purpose. I think it gives us a new life, and I'm glad you have that back. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ACEs study. So in 1980, Dr. Vincent Felitti, he was a physician in San Diego, California, working for the big healthcare system, Kaiser Permanente. Was that to improve overall health, and the target was primary prevention or secondary prevention. Regardless, they would end up gaining weight again, and a good percentage of them would drop out of treatment. Okay, and they wanted to know what is really happening, that even after successful treatment, why are these people dropping out? And one of the connections that Dr. Felitti started making was that patients who did have this issue with morbid obesity had a lot of adversities that may be contributing to this. Okay. So at the same time, there were other providers who were noticing that, and they designed the study to look at what are some of the factors. So they've when they developed the questionnaire for adverse childhood experiences, they looked at 10 different variables, and that was physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, divorce, incarceration in the family, more importantly, parents, substance abuse, mostly in parents, mental illness, and violence towards the mother. And they looked at that, and what they found out was that there was a very strong relationship between chronic conditions, both mental and physical, and adverse childhood experiences. So the more the adverse childhood experiences, the higher the chance of those conditions. So there was a higher incidence of morbid obesity, major depressive disorder, substance use disorders like smoking, tobacco use, drugs, alcohol, suicidality. There was a very significant link, about somewhere between 60 to 80% higher risk of patients of suicide risk among patients who've had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. Other conditions that were strongly correlated with adverse childhood experiences included diabetes, lung disease, chronic lung disease, especially asthma and COPD, sexually transmitted diseases and increased sexual partners, diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune illnesses, and so on and so forth. In fact, later research done has found an increased correlation between adverse childhood experiences and 7 out of 10 major chronic conditions in among people. So again, the whole what and since then, since the 1980s, there have been multiple research done looking at transgenerational trauma. They're looking at historical trauma, looking at suicidality among youth as well as adults or minority population. They have found not just increased prevalence of adverse childhood experiences, but correlation in all these chronic conditions. And, I think that is where I'm going to thank Don again for sharing his story with us, because I think it highlights so many different layers of, when how trauma is experienced by not just the person, or it's almost like by everyone around that person. It's beyond just the event itself. Don used the term trauma with the big T and the small t, but that is what it is. That the incident happens and is done with and is in the past, but it's the long-term effects it leaves on our brain and our body, and how our brain and our body then learn to respond to little things in our lives that just freezes us. So yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shakir. Appreciate you sharing giving us the framework on the studies. I think that's really helpful for us to know that there's not only that we're not alone in this, right? I love that we have Don sharing his personal story, and I love that we have the statistics, because those of us or those who are at home, maybe, a lot of times we feel like we're the only ones, and we're not. So, what did you want to say something? No? Okay. So I'm going to pivot to Dr. Wade. Mike, it's your turn. Dr. Wade is one of our psychologists at the Detroit VA hospital, and you also are a uniformed police officer. And I apologize, I didn't give you the proper introduction. But Dr. Wade can you pivot? We're going to pivot a little bit. Can you talk about the difference between trauma, and that's the word we've been using, and stress, and when it can develop in an individual's life?
Yeah. So there's going to be a couple different pieces that we're going to look at. So kind of chemically in your body, there's not much difference, right? Your stress response cycle is going to activate because you're nervous speaking to crowds or if a bear is about to attack you. And it's the same chemical process. So deep in our body, it's going to be the exact same thing. The main difference we're going to look at is stress is just kind of a normal experience that humans have, right? It's uncomfortable, it's not fun, but given time, we can tend to work through it. New stress may present and we consistently are working through it, but we can reach a conclusion. The thing with trauma is it's a very specific type of experience that overwhelms your ability to cope. You don't actually get to a conclusion point, and so you kind of get stuck in that chronic stress cycle. So it starts impacting kind of to your story, right? It impacts our behaviors, the things we do. We don't leave the house, things like that. It can impact our thinking, the way we think about ourselves, how safe the world is, how we relate to other people, things like that. And so it has a little bit more of a longer term impact than just our normal human stress. And it can honestly happen at any time. All right. So stress can happen. Stress is normal. You'll experience it to some degree pretty much every day. It may not be high highs, but we'll experience some. Trauma can happen pretty much any time as well. It'll increase given certain adversities, which is kind of what the study is looking at. But sincerely, it could happen whenever. One of the big things we also kind of look at, and this gets into kind of that intergenerational, is the learned behaviors. So if I'm a child being raised by a parent who's experienced trauma, I'm observing, how do I handle stress? How do I work through these things? How do I think about these things? We absorb that, then we grow up and maybe we have children and they're going to absorb what I learned, which is what my parents potentially learned, right? And it kind of keeps getting passed down through those generations until someone decides to a certain point. Sounds like you were one of those people, right? Of, yeah, no, this ain't working anymore. I'm going to try and learn new strategies. And one of the biggest types of therapy we have is what's called an exposure therapy, right? So it encompasses two different pieces, kind of depending on what's going on. But one is the speaking the story. So you're 100% correct. The owning it and the speaking it from start to finish helps your brain kind of absorb that I am not in that stressful situation anymore. I can kind of get to that conclusion, which is where trauma usually gets stuck. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Wade, for that thorough. I've heard her give that spiel before, and I love it every time she does. So I love to be reminded of the pieces of that. So with that being said, Mr. Brough, you are a work with families and children locally here in Farmington.
I do.
Yeah. And we're really thankful to have you here as well as part of our community conversation. We've talked a little bit about what the ACEs are, the categories. What are some of the risk factors that you've found in the work that you've done in your personal experience?
So risk factors, I kind of in this conversation divided about into three, right? Individual risk factors associated with the family, or risk factors associated with the community that you live in or reside in, right? So in the ones that are here that I have written down, doesn't mean that's all of them, right? I think the risk factors are honestly a lot, just depending on a lot of different variables and a lot of different things. Doesn't mean that this is the only list of risk factors that are stated, right? So, when it comes to individuals, if a child has like special needs, disabilities, medical concerns, things like that, can be a risk factor. If a child doesn't feel close to their caregivers or parents, that's a risk factor. A child engaging or experiencing sexual activity at an early age is a risk factor. Not feeling close with friends, have a limited, or families have a limited understanding of what the child needs, which now I guess I'm transitioning to families a little bit, but yeah, abuse or neglect on the families and or caregivers and towards that child. Single parent homes can be a risk factor. We mentioned divorce when it came to one of the ACEs. Thank you. As one of the ACEs, and so that can happen. Low income families, poor education, or not poor education, but lower levels of education. parents experiencing stress or economic stress, right? So if, like you were saying, if a parent's kind of experiencing it and how they're relating to it or how they're reacting to it, the child learns from that. And so that then continues down from generation to generation. Corporal punishment or physical forms of discipline can be a risk factor, or is often a risk factor. Low levels of monitoring or supervision. So parents out and about all the time, working, potentially a single family home, working a lot, but the parents or the children are home by themselves can be a risk factor when there's not a lot of adult supervision to watch those kids, right? Additionally, families isolating themselves from other people. So neighbors, friends, family, just not really communicating in the home. Everyone's staying home. You kind of even mentioned that too, right? Negative conflict in the home. So parents, if there's a 2-parent home or even a single family home with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and how they interact when stress happens, right? If they argue, if they yell, if they get physical with each other, which is another one, parents getting physical with each other in the home can cause some of those risks or increases of ACEs. When it comes to communities, living in a community that is high rates of violence or crime, that community has high levels of poverty or poor education, in that community, high levels of unemployment, easy access to drugs and alcohol, neighbors moving in and out, so not very consistent with the people around you. Few community activities for young people to do, whether it's parks, whether it's activities such as like a YMCA or community programs that offer to kids if there's not as much access to that. Unstable housing, unstable utilities, and then if food insecurity is additional one, and then high levels, if the communities are experiencing high levels of social and environmental disorder. Or again, that was kind of a big range of random different things. Those are some of the things that I've written down, but that's definitely not the end of the list. There's a lot of other potential risk factors, again, depending on family, depending on child, depending on community, that could attribute to the ACEs for sure.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
I find it interesting because a lot of times when I first learned about this study, thank you. You're a wonderful analyst. Some of the things that I was educated on, like the list you're just saying, I was like, oh my gosh, that's me. Oh my gosh, that's me. I didn't know. I didn't consider that to be trauma. I didn't. And a lot of times, to going back to Don's example, unless we embrace it and recognize it, we don't even know we're dealing with it. And then like Dr. Wade was saying, we're just reacting, whether we're parents and we think we're rearing children the way that makes sense, and we're doing the best we can in the moment, but we don't know what we don't know. But the more we're able to look at ourselves seriously and the world around us, the better we can assist the next generation. One of the pieces you also said that before we get into the next panelist, is that when we're looking at communities, and I think a lot of our communities are disproportionately experiencing more ACEs than some other ones. And as providers and or just community members, to recognize that, where we can give a hand up to where if I'm living in a neighborhood and we're all having food insecurity, we all don't have access to, livable wage jobs. Sure. Who's gonna be the help, right? And so that's where it's really valuable to have programs like that we work in, that we volunteer in, and just to recognize that those of us who have more, there's opportunity to share. But that's my personal plug. I went off script a little bit. I apologize. I'm going to pivot to Dr. Shakir, who is a child psychiatrist, but you also work with adults, Vista Maria, Wayne State University professor. You're on the board of SAFE. So many amazing things you've done. Would you explain the impact of toxic stress and these adverse childhood events on the human development and well-being long-term for the individual?
Sure.
Thank you.
I also want to highlight, before I do that not all stress is equally toxic to everybody. So our experience having the same stress, the same incident, the same event may be experienced differently by different people. Like the same way as people who go, military, for example, or first responders, they may have the same experience but they may not have the same trauma response. And I think that is extremely important to understand so that we don't put everybody in one bucket because they had one experience, right? So when we talk about toxic stress really, as it implies, is toxic experience. And many times it is when there are adversity after adversity after adversity. So to the point where it's like layer and layer and layer of trauma, sometimes little things that accumulate and get to a point where the way our brain and our body responds to anything that comes our way shows a traumatic response. Okay. So there are two areas that it really affects. And one is the way our process our environment and the way we process what our body is telling us. So the way we process our environment, there's a term called neuroception. Okay. And what it really is how do we differentiate if something is coming our way, if it is dangerous or not? So there's an actual threat, but then there's something called perceived threat. So is our brain and body gotten used to reacting to every stress as a perceived threat? You know, somebody comes, my child is running to me for a hug, and I get startled as if somebody's going to attack. And we hear that from parents, especially mothers who have had trauma, and they become uncomfortable from the embrace of their kids. They don't tolerate that. Okay. So their body, even though they want that hug, but they react to it differently. Okay. The same thing is how we interpret what's going on in our body in order to, when a baby is born, a newborn cannot differentiate between different things that are happening inside her or his body. It's with time and caregiving that they differentiate that whether, I'm uncomfortable because my diaper's wet versus I need a bottle versus I want to play with my mom, So, and that is called interoception. That's our ability. And these two things are significantly affected when we have early onset trauma. And that can happen anytime, as Dr. Wade and Mr. Brough and Don's story highlighted for us, that it can even happen before a person is born when it comes to generation historical trauma. So there are multiple domains that are affected. In fact, it would be fair to say that there's no one developmental domain that is not affected when there is toxic trauma. Now, one trauma here and there, let's say you're growing up in a loving family and you're going on a car ride and somebody hit the car, you're fine, but you're shocked. There's a shock, there's some shock. That's very different. Okay. That is very different from when you live in poverty. Your parents have substance use issues. You're not in a safe environment. There's violence, there's drugs, there's mental illness, there's physical illnesses, medical trauma. It's very different. It gets to a point where there's layer after layer after layer to the point where one event is not differentiated from the next.
Yeah, I kind of talk about like an episode versus an environment. When it's kind of a one-off, I have the time to kind of work through, cope. But when it's an environment, my ability to reach an end point is disrupted.
Precisely, Dr. Wade.
Present.
Yes, and then everything gets affected. Everything, our ability, our ability to take care of our body, thinking, planning, organizing. What we expect. As we get older, we are expected to do well in school and behave on the dinner table and then grow older and go to college and have a profession and career and, be able to buy a house and organize our room and all that. All of that gets disrupted because it becomes mush. It's like, our ability to live a life starts getting governed by these maladaptive maps that we have made in our lives, because of our experiences. So just to summarize that we all, our experiences allow us to make maps, the way we look at our 4 maps of the world, what we're going to expect, who we are, what we're going to expect, what we expect from people, what we expect from us. And all of that gets, for lack of a better word, maybe ruined because of all these traumatic experiences that have had happened around, with us, either because we belong in a family which is sort of trauma ridden or adversity ridden or other factors. So
So what you mentioned um, about the physical aspects
yes.
of trauma. After I, crashed, for lack of a better word, the physical problems I started having
Yes.
were and they were really weird things. My head felt like there was fire coming out of it, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it really affected various parts of my body. I spent a year going to one specialist after another and then trying to figure out what really is physical and what is a physical manifestation of the anxiety. Well, with therapy and over time, 99% of them went away. I still have a couple.
But that is what it is, that when that does happen, and when it really hits us, it's almost like your brain is trying to tell you something. And if you're not listening to the brain, it's like, I'm going to make your body talk. Yeah. And then our body starts talking, and that is how it talks, Sometimes we feel more pain, sometimes less. Sometimes there are weird sensations, and you're like, the doctors look at you and like, what are you talking about? There's no symptom cluster like that. But those are true experiences, though. It's not that you're making yourself imagine. This is how your body is telling you. It's experiencing those emotions that way.
I got a very small example, and it's probably more of a little T than a big T, as you described it. But I got in 2022 in summer, I got in a car accident. The car came out, and I ended up T-boning the car. But the afterwards effects, right, about what your body does. Now, whenever I see a car or a car coming up to a stop sign or a stoplight kind of quick, we'll have those cars that kind of stop at the last second before they go through the stop sign or light. I white knuckle it every time, and I'm already turning to the side of the road or the opposite side of the road because that's just my body's reaction to what
I
happened.
had exactly the same experience a year before that. And now, anytime I reach a corner, I don't care if the light turned right. I'm looking to see, what
There's a car there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. It's learned behaviors,
Correct.
learned survival. I mean, that's really what it is. We are human beings and we're created to survive. And that's our body, our mind reacting to all that. So those are great examples. Okay. So we're going to pivot a little bit more to Mr. Buff. What we'd like you to talk about right now are what are some of the protective factors that may mitigate the effects of these adverse childhood events?
Yeah. So yes, there are protective factors, like you mentioned, to mitigate or to prevent maybe some of the ACEs if it's used or if families are doing this or communities are doing this before, maybe even some of the adverse experiences occur to said child. But some of those factors could be for the child, like having good friends, positive friends, right? Friends that don't necessarily get into the drugs or alcohol, or getting good grades that are positive, supportive individuals in child's life. Having a good, I don't want to say maybe a good education, but having a school system that is around the child or children to promote learning and activities and asking questions and getting involved is very helpful when it comes to the positive factors for these kids. Having other adults that aren't necessarily parents, right? So we can talk about teachers or talk about counselors at the school, neighbors, family, friends, or whatnot that are interested in the child's life is also huge, because you get more people or the community around those children, a number of people, and they have more people to turn to, more people to talk to, more people to tell their story about or have a communication about when things do come up, right? Income can be that, obviously, with being involved with more income might be the communities that have more resources and more things to get involved in. So maybe being involved in things like that, consistent family rules or guidelines, right? So if a child is doing something and they know, okay, if I do this, I know mom and dad are gonna, give me this consequence or this discipline. They know the outcome, right? Rather than the opposite, where, if I do this, maybe mom and dad will ignore me, or maybe they'll react in such a big way, right? Potentially. So I think that is important. Feeling safe at home, safe at school, safe in your community, away from crime, away from drugs and alcohol, away from all the dangers that in some areas of the country that are experiencing. And then in society, I kind of mentioned the programming and resources. If there's more programming, more activities, more things for kids to get involved in or to be a part of, the more factors that are there to, again, counteract the ACEs. So even though maybe ACEs are experienced by children, these protective factors can help them cope with that better, so that it's not not that it's not going to impact kids into their adulthood, but maybe mitigate them or make them handle those situations better or work through them better than having a negative reaction and continuing that negative reaction and continuing the cycle, right? Moving forward. So yeah.
There was a research
Yeah.
article written, I think it was actually Detroit Public Schools. I may be making that piece up though, that looked at the teacher's expectation of the children and how children responded to that. So if the teacher has high expectations and fosters the children to achieve, the children were more likely to achieve. They had higher rates of graduation in the children as part of the study. There are higher grades in general. So when you kind of mentioned the schooling piece, right? Like it was a public school system in an inner city, right? But because the teacher had belief in the children met the expectation. And it's that belief that's the key piece.
You mentioned the income part, right? And I put that both in there, the ACEs and with the PCEs. But I think just like you said, it's income. I mean, yes, it matters for the sense of where you're located and where you are and maybe the type of school district, but one teacher in a low income district or one facility or one resource in a low income district can make a huge change or a huge difference in community, child, family, community, all the above. So I say income for both positive and negative, but it really doesn't, it just depends on the individual's family, society, community, so on and so forth.
You're absolutely correct. I spent 37 years teaching lower elementary school in the Detroit school system. I never lowered my expectations
Yes.
in those 37 years. And 95% of the kids, and this is all lower income kids, a lot of mostly single parent households, a lot of stuff going on. They live up to those expectations. Sure. Absolutely.
And that is the school system. I mean, that has been found to be a consistent protective factor, whether we are looking at children with adverse childhood experiences, we're looking at minority kids, we're looking at delinquent kids who have even had trouble with the law, even from them, sort of diverting them to actually away from the jail and the correctional system. School plays a very, very important role because that provides these children with role models that outside of their family, outside of their, community that may have a lot of adversities and gives them positive people they can look up to and be like. I have a question for you.
Sure.
I know you work at Farmington Youth Assistance,
Yes,
right?
ma'am.
And that when we're talking about mitigating factors, I mean that's what plays a very important role. Can you highlight a little bit about your role and what does the programs do? What
Sure.
kind of services there are?
So with Youth Assistance is a Oakland County organization or a program, excuse me. So Youth Assistance is funded through the county, Oakland County, me specifically through Farmington Hills and the school district, right? So like the school district helps with like my office space and things like that. And the cities help with our programming that we provide. So what the core of Youth Assistance is to provide youth and families with resources in the community, with support to help to mitigate or eliminate delinquency and neglect in Oakland County, honestly. So what we do as caseworkers is take on families through referrals that we get from either the school, the community being the parents themselves, police officers, the school, really anybody, to work with family if there's an identified concern that an individual has, right? Or even the parent themselves, right? My kids are having these behaviors X, Y, and Z. I need assistance with how to handle those things, right? So whether that's through my casework services or me referring them out to other services within Farmington Hills, or the surrounding area, I will do just that. I will try to find whatever resources to help the child, whether that's something as simple as getting an activity for the kid, right? Getting them into soccer, getting them into tennis, getting them into swimming, or getting them into band, whatever, art classes, things like that. I know, funds being an issue with that. We assist with that at times. We're also, like this summer, for instance, we're doing and this is all my board. We have a volunteer board of directors who creates all the programming. I don't do any of that. I mean, I help with the programming and I provide my input, but the board does all the programming, and they do a very good job at that. But for instance, this summer, a week in July, we're doing it's kind of like an educational camp. I guess I'm gonna call. I don't know the exact name that's been created yet, but it's a math camp, STEM camp, enrichment camp, and book club that we're doing for 4 days in July, where the kids come to the Farmington High School for 4 days and have these activities, so it gives them additional education, more kids to be around for support, parents, the opportunity to get, things done during that week, or responsibilities done, and gives, the kids an activity to do over the summer instead of sitting at home playing video games or whatever else they're going to do. Right. So we're doing that. We're also looking to maybe get a women's empowerment group. We did this a couple of years ago, but trying to get, I'm not sure the age range we're looking at yet, but like a girls empowerment group created for girls to kind of relate to each other and get some positivity with each other and things like that, build self-esteem. We do stuff for the school. We offer, mini grants to the school to help with mental health awareness day or week or whatever it is that they're looking at. We do a lot of different things. We do book clubs throughout the school right now. We recently did a digital decorum where we went to an elementary school and a middle school and educated the kids on appropriate digital etiquette, right? What to put on the internet, what not to put on the internet, what to keep off. Yeah, it's pulled. We try to address the concerns. I mean, I'm addressing things specifically in Farmington. So there's caseworkers all over the county. Every single school district has their own youth assistance caseworker. Some even have they split one. So I think they case with Park and Clausen have, I might be wrong with that, but I have a caseworker for each one. So I'm focused on Farmington Hills. What are the concerns here with the kids? What are the concerns with the families? What is the school saying are the issues and problems? Now, probably every area in Oakland County or Michigan, the country has issues with internet and kids using it appropriately. But that's one of the feedback we got is kids putting appropriate things on the internet, talking appropriately. So that's how we addressed it with that kind of educational piece. And we still got a few more of the dates. I didn't bring it with me and I totally escaped me. We've got a few dates at the library coming up, I think in June here and I think at the end of the month for the digital decorum in the evening for parents and kids to go to kind of get some knowledge and education on that. So a lot. I'm very moldable and very bendable to my families and kids. Whatever the kids and family needs, I'm willing to, if I'm able to, bend to help them out. I do the best that I can in those situations. And some families aren't ready, right? So it's a voluntary program. Some families come back and say, Jeff, we're not there yet. Yep. We're not in need of services, or I've got too many things going on right now to add something else is just be too much. And so that's understandable too. And my services are open. I have my caseload of kids, but I'm open to the whole community. So if a family calls me and says, Jeff, this is an issue I'm seeing, can you help me with this? Sure, I can do what I can to help you out with that. So
I still learned about one literally today called Family First through the state of Michigan that does something kind of similar, and it's to keep children out of foster care.
Yeah.
So how can we help support the family so that they can provide for the children, keep them out of the system?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, anecdotally have friends and family who have successfully used that program.
Nice.
So yeah, I think part of it too is when we're in stressful environments and we don't have a lot of resources, it's hard to have the time and space to look for the resources. I think that's where it's really important to have those community entities where someone knows that's your
for you.
Exactly, because you're busy trying to put food on the table and pay the bills and make sure your kids aren't, busting each other up. But nevertheless, so thank you for doing what you do. And I think it's really important that, you actually brought up a few other areas that are free and you could be a little bit more private. Maybe if you want to dip your toes into getting help, you know, you can go to the
Yeah.
library, has a lot of free anonymity, I guess is the word I want to say. Maybe
Mhm.
you're not ready to make that call for help, but you go to the library, the YMCA has a lot of things. You know, a lot of faith communities offer things. Sometimes we just have to dip our toes before we have the, you know,
Yeah.
strength to ask.
And you know, I think families who faced adversities for generations don't know anything outside of those adversities.
Yes.
So even if change, which is for the better, is overwhelming, you know, I
It's
mean,
the unknown, right?
yes. So we sometimes wonder, why would somebody not make positive change? But we have to. It's very hard to wear their shoes and be in their shoes, you know.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm thinking, going back to previous points that we made, that things that adults may not consider trauma to children, they can be not only little t, but they can be big T. And
Yeah.
what comes to my mind immediately is a car accident. It's not serious. Nobody's hurt. You kind of just blow it off as adults. But for a child in that car, I mean, that's a major event.
Yes.
And there are others that we've all experienced little T's as children,
Yes.
thinking about it. Something I never really thought about until the last 2 weeks. But indeed, it's true of all of us.
Yes.
And the other point is I'm looking at it from a different generation.
And that's
Dr. Shakir, I could, maybe if I started young, I could be your father. I could definitely be your grandfather. I got 3 of you. And I'm thinking about what I went through, and I think mine was generational. And I think that as a baby, I picked up on the vibes
Yes.
and the anxiety of the family and the tension with my father having to commute to work and what they went through. And I think mine is generational, and I'm thinking about my grandchildren. You know, is it possible to break the cycle? My grandson, when my son took his own life, it was the day before my grandson's 11th birthday. And it has taken him, it took him 5 years before he would talk about his father,
Yes.
before he would even look at pictures of his father.
Sure.
Now he wears his father's t-shirts and his father's clothes, and his father was teaching him to play the guitar. My son was a talented musician. He wouldn't touch that. He, after 5 years, he took that back up. So I'm wondering, I assume it's something he will always be working through his whole life. You know, is he a definite candidate for psychological problems as an adult? He's 18 now.
It kind of depends. So, I mean, generally speaking, like the rates of PTSD, which is the like formal mental health diagnosis with big T traumas, most Americans, I'm going to get this exact number wrong, so I'll give a ballpark. Recent research shows that the average American experiences about, I think it was like between 50 to 60, what we would call criterion A events in our life. But the rates of PTSD in America are actually less than 10%. Most humans have the capacity to work through those episodes of trauma, right? So given enough time, given enough support, given enough of those protective factors, they can naturally work through those things. It's not easy, it's not fun, but they can usually get to the other side. If it gets to the point where you start noticing some of those factors, such as like you mentioned, he's becoming a slightly different person, and we can't really track why. That's when having someone kind of outside the system who can look in with that objective stance can be really helpful. People who experience stress are required to go to therapy. It's just, if I want extra support, it is there.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think it is also that, you know, the positive side of this is that, you know, he's really making an effort to get over his avoidance. You know, like for 5 years, it was like, I cannot face it. I'm not going to face it. And then I still cannot face it, but I'm going to try to the point where he's embracing more and more and more. And that is what is really the biggest barrier, avoidance. And that is why, when we stop avoiding, when we embrace our experiences, we accept them, and we find the courage to do something about them and embrace life, then that is when healing starts. And for your grandson, it has started already. It started when he allowed you to say happy birthday to him, again, or wore his father's t-shirt again, or picked up the guitar and said, let me do this. Healing started there. Now, will there be points in his life where he will struggle? We all do. But then he also has a grandfather who has allowed himself to be aware and be intentional about things. So he has all the support.
I thought it was interesting you were saying about PTSD, Pat. A lot of people don't know what it is or that they have it.
Right.
And at one of these community conversations where we were talking to people, to veterans, and one of them described his PTSD. And I said to myself, that's me. That's what I've been going through. A loss of community, a loss of purpose.
Yes.
Those kinds of things. So a lot of people have it and are totally unaware.
Yes. And that's an important point. But that's what it is. We can't do anything about things we're not aware of.
Right.
We have to bring them to light before we can do something.
And the other thing is, how do you get people that the community sees need some kind of help?
Yes.
Not physical help, and are totally unreceptive. We're going through that now with a friend of ours.
There's something in the mental health world we call the stage of change. We all were thinking it. The biggest piece, so there's different levels people are in preparation for change, because no change is fun. But you as kind of like, you just had a friend, right? So like you as a friend is just kind of being the support to them and just kind of seeking and talking with them about what is important to you. Because once they start talking about what's important to me, they can start realizing, I ain't doing anything about that. I'm not getting myself to what's important to me. Yes. And then that they can create that internal desire to change. Because when we are adversarial and we're like, dude, what are you doing? This is not working. You need to be changing this. Stop that. Do this. They can become defensive. And so that decreases the willingness to change.
That's what's happening now. The woman was widowed and had a stroke all within a period of about 6 months. And the community, we've all stepped up and have attended to her physical needs willingly.
Yeah.
But her children, have told her you're going to do this and this and this. And right now, for a month, she is in a senior citizen complex. She's in the independent living part. She is so resistant to it. And her month is about up, and we don't know what she's going to do. She didn't sell the house, but she's determined she's coming home. Well, she'll be forced. She can't live alone, particularly after the stroke, in a 2-story house with the stairs, without a full bath on the first floor. And of course she doesn't want anybody coming into her house to help. How does one come back?
Yeah.
So.
And it depends on how much her reactions are because of her difficulty adjusting versus her health issues, like the stroke itself,
Right.
which sometimes takes away the ability to make rational decisions.
Yeah. Lots of layers. Yes. Lots of layers. And I'm sure we all have different stories and examples. So I appreciate the real world example. Sometimes when we talk about these things, we know it, but when we have specifics, we can bring it into everyday life. Okay, so Dr. Wade,
Yes.
we so we've talked about PTSD, we've talked about trauma, and there's what we call in the field trauma-informed care. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that impacts the healing journey of folks who struggled with ACEs?
Yeah, so trauma-informed care, kind of at its most general baseline, is the general assumption that everyone's experienced a trauma, and that's how we are going to approach the situation. We can understand that everyone's experienced stress, everyone's experienced some sort of trauma, big T, little t, and that's going to impact them in some way. So if we kind of come in from that curiosity approach of, all right, I'm trying to figure out how did it impact you, so that I can kind of tailor my treatment to what you're actually going through versus kind of a blank prescription of just kind of like, you've experienced this, so you're getting this, right? We're trying to understand the why and the outcome, right? So it's that kind of general baseline, because it can impact people in different ways. Some people experience chronic stress and it shows up as depression. It shows up as anxiety. We can see PTSD. We can see a lot of memory and kind of concentration concerns just because of how stress impacts the brain on a more kind of nuanced level. And it's also looking at what I'll call the intensity of treatment. So if we're looking at your risk factors, made me think of this. I just didn't want to interrupt. There's something called Maslow's hierarchy. All right. So it's kind of this understanding of humans have needs at different levels of intensity, and we can't kind of go up the scale in complex needs until we meet the baselines. If we don't have food, if we don't have water, if we don't have shelter, we're not doing anything more complex until that's met. So it's also approaching it of like, okay, where on this hierarchy are you at? If you're not eating every day, if you are homeless, if you are not sleeping well, me trying to get you to challenge you're thinking, those mental maps you talk about, it's not going to happen because these things are more important, right? So it's also kind of figuring out where on that hierarchy are you, so that when we engage in treatment, it's actually going to be helpful, effective. Because if we start off too complex, they'll get frustrated. Their brain's not going to allow them to do these things, and then that's where some of that frustration and that withdrawal can come from. So then if we assume that someone's in the place for kind of trauma and stress specific treatment, where there are some specific treatments we have, there's going to be kind of three primary ones. So I'll just talk about kind of generally. There's what's called cognitive behavioral therapy, and there's some specific ones kind of under that. But it's looking at the way you think impacts your body, impacts what you do. And it's looking at, okay, what for this individual person are they thinking? What is their body doing? What are they doing behaviorally? And how do these all kind of feed each other? So you provide different skills specific to the things they're doing so that they can change the cycle. We've got EMDR, which is a trauma-specific treatment, and it's looking at those mental maps. And it's looking at any experience that person has that is fueling that mental map. If we can change the way you think about those things, your mental maps will change. And then we have one that's called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. And that one is looking at, I talked about values before, that's where this kind of circles back in. It looks at what is important to the person, what are they motivated for, and how is what they're experiencing impeding their ability to get there. So it looks at, is it your thinking that's impeding your ability to get there? How can we change the way you're thinking? Is it the connections I'm making, the behaviors I am doing? It's looking at more what's important to you. And which also kind of makes me think, as you were talking, I'm stealing this from Viktor Frankl. Great book. All of his are great books. But it also kind of looks at the pain versus suffering. Pain is natural and will always happen in people's life. But the way we approach that pain or avoid that pain can cause more problems in our life. And that is when we start, that's where we start suffering. So if we pull on our values, if we pull on what's important to us as a way to work through the pain that's going to happen in life, we stop ourselves from suffering.
Being intentional.
Yes.
Being intentional, working through that suffering.
Yes.
And it looks different for different people. And
Absolutely.
I like the way that you provided 3 different trauma-informed avenues, because what works for me may not work for Dr. Shakir
Right.
for whatever reason. We may experience the same trauma or maybe a similar trauma, but based upon our, the differences between us, I may prefer EMDR and may love it, and you may hate it, right? It's really,
And one of my trauma informed approaches as a psychologist is I'm sitting down with my patient and I'm laying down in a bit more detail what all the options are. I'll tell you which one I think would work best for you, but I know what's going to work best for you is the one that you have control over and the one you pick. So I'm providing you all those options so that you can tell me, right? Because trauma usually takes away someone's sense of power and control. So we want to get that back as much as well, too.
great point,
Yes.
great point.
Yeah.
And that-
Allowing them to actually take power
Yeah.
over their lives, and empowering, after safety and taking care of primitive needs comes empowering, and I see that a lot in kids I work with, that especially runaway youth, they have, they have so many points in their lives where they felt that they lost their control. And, when I meet with them the first time, that is my disclosure for them that I will not do anything without your permission unless you do something real crazy. Then I will have to, yes, and I will need to intervene in that
Yep.
at that point as your treatment provider. But outside of that, you will have control of your treatment. You will have the right to give permission, and I will be asking you for choices. And if they say you're the doc, do whatever, nobody listens to me anyways, I'm like, I'm sitting here trying to listen.
Right.
So thank you for bringing that up, Dr. Wade, because I think it's all about allowing our patients to feel the sense of control again, that they stop being controlling with their lives.
Oh, I love that example too. Yeah, it's very important to allow our the folks we're working with have that choice. And yeah, we own it when we have the choice. So thank you so much. We are going to pivot to questions from the audience at this point, unless anyone else wants to say anything specifically before we move on to some of those general questions. And I'm looking at our tech gurus to make sure I can just continue forward. Okay, great. So we talked a little bit, Dr. Wade, I know you just spoke, but I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about how working with law enforcement, how do you define trauma with that population? How early can it begin? We've maybe danced around this a little bit, or maybe just speak about law enforcement and or veteran military nuances that might be helpful to this conversation.
So there's kind of two routes I'd go with that. And one is my work. I do a lot of training and education with law enforcement about mental health and kind of teaching them that they may be one of the system problems. All right. If someone is in an aversive environment for a long time, your uniform is going to be its own reminder and will get them activated. You will have the best intentions, and it's just that visual stimuli, kind of like what Dr. Shakir talked about. So really educating them on trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed approaches so that they have that awareness kind of going in. And looking at kind of veteran and law enforcement populations as well, there's actually some interesting research into kind of the exposure, not ACEs specifically, but kind of childhood trauma and the role that plays in people's decisions to join military or more kind of structured occupations. Because it can be its own protective factor. Now I've got this inbuilt group where I know I'm getting paid, I know I'm getting fed, I know exactly where my housing is. I've got a group of people that all have a semi-similar mindset. That's why we all volunteered for this. So it can actually be a really great protective factor for some people. But we also know that it can be an additional stressor. If someone is joining with the highest hopes and then they deploy, they experience an assault in the service, they experience some sort of chronic stress, it can overtax the system. And so they're already kind of coming in with that, I call it scaffolding built out of toothpicks instead of steel. And then something more just kind of lands on it because law enforcement military are actually exposed to trauma at higher rates than the general population. So it can be a protective factor for some. It can be an additional stressor for others. Yeah.
I almost went in. I did with the police academy when I was getting out of school.
Mm-hmm.
I was always from freshman year. I was going to be able to be a police officer, right?
Interesting.
But I think some of the, not necessarily personal, but the things that I saw during the training or were included in the training, in my head, I'm like, this is probably isn't the healthiest for me to be in. If I want the things I want out of my life, it's not the best decision for me. So I ended up going a just different direction. But yeah.
Yeah, the research that showed that the average American was between kind of like 50 to 60 also showed that the average American police officer has about 600 Criterion A events. So they are exposed at a significantly higher rate. And that's why when someone goes into law enforcement, a good 95% of departments require psychological evaluations. We are trying to figure out, do you have that kind of baseline capacity? Because, and it also, to a certain extent, is working. They are exposed, 60 to 600 is 10 times, right? Math's not my strong suit. But the rates of PTSD are only between like 13 and 15%. So it's only a little bit higher than the than the general population. So they also have the skills and strategies. It's just also sometimes overcoming that stigma of when that stopped working. What do we need to do? Sometimes it's just a pressure release. It doesn't have to be hugely intensive and private and hospitalization. It can just be like, all right, I just needed to release some pressure, and I'm good. I can go about my way again.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. That the healing journey can be, these moments in time where exponential healing happens when we've been maybe working in therapy for a long time, and then something happens. Maybe you have a positive exchange with someone, and it's life-changing.
Yeah, I think, when it comes to professions that are high risk for, exposure to trauma, or I think one thing that really plays a protective role is our satisfaction with the work we're doing.
Yeah.
That valuing behavior. The value that we put in our work, whether it is law enforcement, it is military, it is working with people with adversities, because that can also cause trauma in the person who's working with them. And just the value we put in, that, okay, this is giving me purpose. This is giving me personal value and is helping me with the sense of self. That can be very protective rather than, begrudgingly going and doing something that you hate, but you don't have any other options,
Right. That's another piece, going back to those options, right? When we empower people, when we use our own power, when we remind ourselves we have those options, whether or not we're recovering from trauma or a healthy profession, usually there's more than one way out. And a lot of times when folks have been struggling with trauma, they can get tunnel vision and struggle to see that there are options. Maybe they're not great options, but the fact that we have them and can put them on the table, that's where that empowerment comes in. So
it's the courage to choose.
courage to choose.
Your choice making, being able to make a choice is a fundamental human right. It's when we find the courage to choose is what matters. And once we find that courage, then healing starts.
Well said. And so I'm just also looking at the time. This has been a really lovely, rich discussion. We probably have time for one or two more questions. And I would like to, this could be for anyone, because you're professionals and or concerned citizens. When we're doing the work of healing with folks, how do we ensure we're not re-traumatizing people? Or, as a young social worker, I always worried about that because I would go deep really soon with folks.
Yeah.
And, how do we temper that? Any one of you could.
I mean, I have thoughts, but I
Go
talk
ahead,
a
you start
lot.
with your thoughts.
Well, it's one of those, I have the conversation kind of early with my people because I do focus on trauma and crisis treatment of this will not be fun.
Yeah.
You tell me the pace we're going at. And if I say something that does disrupt you, I will never purposefully or maliciously attempt to do that. But if it lands somewhere on that mental map, you can talk to me about it. I can receive your frustration. I can receive all your reactions to it. And I can hold it and we can have a conversation about it and we can keep moving. It doesn't have to stop there. And so just kind of keeping that door opened and making sure there's transparency and this is what this is going to look like because it's not going to feel good. And just kind of always having that transparency.
If I could jump in before
Yes.
any of the other folks say, I really appreciate that you said that because not every profession or person who wants to be a helper in the healing process is willing to do that or is able to handle that. So I think that goes back to folks recognizing that there is choice in where you want to get your healing from, whether it's professionally or if it's with lay people. There's lots of people who are caring and concerning, but not necessarily maybe the person that you want to divulge everything to because they can't handle it like a Nevertheless, I just wanted to make that statement that because that's very important that the person feels comfortable to say, ouch. And if I can't process that with you, then that's not the right venue, right fit.
I think it's meeting people where they're at.
Yes, you said
Readiness
that.
for change. Or,
Yes, meeting them where they're at, and I think there is a difference. But it's a strength in a therapist or a clinician when they have the ability to be patient. However, there's a difference between patient and avoidance.
Yes.
So we have to be patient with our patients, but not avoidant of holding their emotions when they're ready to share it. Because I think that is the balance that we have to find. Because not allowing them to share can be traumatizing too. So, again, the balance between to meet them where they're at, being attuned. It's like many times that's a parental role. We are attuned to our patients, and kind of meet them where they are. If they're crying, oh well, I'll get another box of tissue.
One of my early supervisors talked about being the Tupperware. Like you are putting all your stuff into my Tupperware. I have a space, I can hold it, and it is totally fine that you do that. That is what that is built for, is to receive that stuff. Like, yeah.
It's very practical.
Yeah.
Coming at it from the other side. When I first started with the psychologist, after a little while, he suggested making a schedule to get me to do things. This is what you're going to do. I would decide, of course, this is what you're going to do. This is what time you're going to do it. Talk about creating more anxiety. And again, the patient has to be fluid. So does the therapist. And I went to him and I said, this is not working. I am just so stressed out here. It's 10 o'clock and I haven't done this yet. And so I suggested, let me make a schedule. Let me put down a daily schedule. What do I have to accomplish? Which isn't a whole lot. What should I accomplish? And what can be put off? Now, that's dangerous because I am a first-class procrastinator, which is a whole other issue, which leads to depression also. And that's what I did. And that's what I've been doing all along. The things that I have to get done today. And because I'm a procrastinator, an hour before I came here, I was organized and writing down what I wanted to say. That had to be done today. I had another meeting this morning. There was stuff I had to have done. And that gets done. But things like, he had scheduling, this is what time you should brush your teeth. That's a should. It should be done today. It does get done today, but
it's a little rigid.
If I'm not going out of the house, sometimes it's not until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then things that I really should do, but there's no rush. And some of those things remain on that list for a month. And I said, okay, now I feel like doing it.
Right.
And I
So this
did.
should be done, right?
Exactly. But that's just an example where the therapy initially,
Cause some conflict.
was creating a lot of conflict.
Well, because there's also something called unconditional positive regard. I am here to help you pull out the things that are working and work with you to change the things that aren't. So it's also finding the balance of like, all right, this ain't working for you. We need to get more things in your schedule. But tell me, how's the schedule already been working for you? Do you have a way that you use that? Okay, cool. Let's use that and then add this extra thing into it. Because everyone has those protective factors. They have the strategies that work for them. That's why we're all unique. So what are those? And then how can we use those to challenge these things that aren't working?
And he was more than willing to let me take the lead.
Yeah.
Which is good. Sometimes we as individuals too, as workers or service providers, have to identify maybe we're the problem sometimes. I've had a couple of kids where I've said that I've had you for a year and a half. There has not been a change made yet. We're still talking about the same thing as you walked in the first day and spoke with me. Maybe I'm not doing this correctly. Maybe it's time to find somebody else that can work with you better than I do, right? I've had to do that a couple of times, and I'll admit that. But I do the same thing with my kids that you mentioned, right? We're going to talk about uncomfortable things. If you're uncomfortable, that's fine. Tell me you're uncomfortable. Maybe we'll get to it at a different time, different meeting, whatever down the road when you're more comfortable. I'm a stranger that you don't know, and I'll expect you to trust me with all of your deepest, darkest secrets on day one. And so that's how I explain it to the kids: is at your own pace, where you're comfortable, where you feel good about or comfortable about talking to me about these things. If you never get to that point, that's fine. But let's talk about the things that we can work on, talk about, have a conversation about.
And Dr. Shakir also mentioned, but it's like explaining the boundaries, especially when they know that we know it might activate one of those adversive experiences. So like me working with law enforcement, I had to connect with them on wellness checks a lot. And I also work with a lot of people in crisis. And it's like, look, there are limits to what we can do out here. If you can engage with me, if you communicate with me, there's things we can do with that. But just know we're walking that line of where I might have to pull someone in. And I'm doing that out of care for you.
Right.
But just know that that is a thing.
Yeah.
And that's where those kind of limits with confidentiality come from. Those legal standards kind of come from. And just making sure people know when we are approaching that line so they don't feel bombarded. They don't feel surprised. Yeah.
People who have not been able to trust anybody,
Mm-hmm.
We have to be patient that they're not just gonna trust us. They may never trust us, even though they may see us for 3-4 years, but they may trust enough that we do not mean harm.
Yes.
And sometimes that's all. I think on part of healthcare providers, if we expect that, miraculously, just because I have a credential next to my name, that all of a sudden, a person is going to trust me, that's not going to happen. And sometimes, I want to, people who are watching as well, I want to tell them that, don't feel that you have to go in a healthcare provider's office and immediately trust them. You may not be able to trust that person for months. That is okay, as long as you have at least a little bit of confidence that this person's not going to do you any harm, and that whatever they're saying is out of your best interest. And that's usually a good starting point.
Yep.
Well said. I think we're coming about up on time, if I understand. We've got 1 to 2 more minutes. So I would like to open the floor. Is there any last comments, last pieces of wisdom you want to share, or plugs for anything personal?
I just have to say that I've enjoyed this experience tremendously. Number one, it's therapeutic for me to tell my story again. And I learned a lot because the three of you, being very knowledgeable, came at the same topic from 3 different angles. And boy, am I going to have a good session with my therapist tomorrow.
I'd say Oakland County has a very good CIT program. So that's a crisis intervention team program that trains law enforcement all throughout Oakland County. So if it does appear to be more of mental health concern you're calling the police on, not every department has formed CIT teams, but they pretty much all have CIT trained officers. So I would just advise the community, if you feel like having someone who has additional training in mental health as law enforcement would be beneficial to while you're calling, you are free to request that, and dispatch will do the best they can to connect you with that type of officer. So those resources are available.
And another one I'd like to make a plug for is 988, which is the 24/7 crisis line. That is a step below an emergency and a crisis where you would call in for police. But they can walk you through, they can help you get resources, connect you. You can call on behalf of yourself or someone else. And they have certain options if you're a veteran or LGBTQ plus identifying youth. So they have specific folks who are trained to work with those issues. So that's something that's available to everyone. So that's another option. Does anybody else want to give any other thoughts or?
I just want to thank everybody.
Yeah.
And, it's been, I agree with Don. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm at the side. I'll keep it simple.
Well, thank you so much for being willing to have the comfortable dialogue, and we've learned from each other. We're really thankful to just be here with the community, and we are going to wrap up into a video to talk a little bit more about SAFE and what we do and why we have these community conversations. And just recognize you're not alone, and there's people out here who really do care and really are doing their here for you. So thank you.